There's 1,000 songs. And it goes right in my pocket.
Failure of the future has to be a nation that is agile, that is innovative, that is creative.
Welcome to Future², the podcast all about innovation in the enterprise, brought to you and run by Collective Campus, an innovation hub based in Australia that works with companies to help them adopt the mindset, methodologies and tools to successfully explore new business models and disruptive innovation in an era of rapid change. For more information, go to www.collectivecamp.us. And without further ado, here's today's podcast. Hi everybody, welcome back to Future². Steve here. It's been a very exciting week for the team here at Collective Campus. Our podcast hit number 1 on iTunes Business News last week, as well as the top 20 iTunes business category overall. So thank you so much for your support. If you haven't already, we'd love it if you'd spend just 1 minute to rate us 5 stars on either iTunes or Stitcher, depending on whether or not you're an Apple person or you prefer the ways of the Android. I've also just released the Innovation Manager's Handbook, which you can, funnily enough, download at theinnovationmanagershandbook.com, completely free. Basically a guide for the corporate innovation manager and the entrepreneur. Today's guest comes all the way from Oklahoma City in the United States Midwest. David Burkus is the author of The Myths of Creativity, the truth about how innovative companies and people generate great ideas. He's an associate professor of management at Oral Roberts University, where he teaches courses on creativity, entrepreneurship, and organizational behavior. He's also the founder and host of LDRLB, a podcast on leadership, innovation, and strategy. He's just released Under New Management, How Leading Organizations Are Upending Business as Usual, in which he challenges many of the long-standing management disciplines we take for granted, with new and radical alternatives that seem to be working at some of today's more progressive organizations. I really enjoyed chatting with David, and I'm sure you'll enjoy this podcast. So without further ado, here we go. Welcome to the show, David.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
No, it's an absolute pleasure. It's an absolute pleasure. You're calling us all the way from sunny Oklahoma in the Midwest?
I am. It is, I can't tell you exactly what it is Celsius, but it's like 85 degrees Fahrenheit so that's pretty awesome. Awesome.
I think that equates to 25 degrees Celsius, so nice and sunny.
Pretty awesome weather. That's what for March, pretty awesome weather. Other places in the United States are in snowstorms right now. So, hey, life is good.
Yeah, perfect. And, I'm a big NBA fan, and, OKC are doing quite well, looking to make a big push in the playoffs. How do you think they'll go?
Yeah, I mean, I would love to say, hey, they'll go all the way, but I spent most of my life as a Philadelphia 76ers fan, so I'm used to disappointment. I was probably most avid of a Thunder fan when we had a really, really good shot and were almost in the finals and then sort of lost out. So I'm still used to disappointment. But honestly, it's been so long since honestly, our professional sports team in this state for the longest time has been the University of Oklahoma, meaning collegiate sports, and so we didn't pay attention to pro anything.
Yeah.
Or we were loyal to Dallas, right, which is depressing to me. So we're just happy to have a team that actually can, make an impact compared to there's a lot of NBA teams that you wouldn't even know they're in your own city, and so we're proud of having one that at least is known.
Yeah. Well, I think if Russell Westbrook...
And now I know how widely known because of you, so there you go.
Well, there you go. Yeah, no, look, NBA is huge here. And as far as disappointment goes, I'm a lifelong Phoenix Suns fan, and I think that says it all. I think the proudest moment we had was when we stole Charles Barkley from your beloved 76ers back in 1992 or whatever it was. But anyway.
Yeah, that was when I stopped paying attention to the Sixers, actually.
Yeah.
Actually, no. I mean, I was reinvigorated by Allen Iverson for a time, and then that actually got more depressing than Charles Barkley. So
Yes, I can imagine. Anyway, I digress from today's topic of discussion. You have recently released, although it's not yet been released, but it's about to, is that right?
So it depends on where you are.
Yeah.
In the United States, it is out. In most of the Commonwealth countries, it is awaiting publication.
Sure. So
it may actually be out by the time somebody's listening to this, depending on how quickly on the spot from download to listen they go.
Okay, fair enough. Cool. So what we're talking about, of course, is your book, Under New Management, which basically talks about redefining some of the long-standing management disciplines we've been taking for granted and puts forward some alternatives. So I guess I wanted to talk through some of the alternatives you put forward in your book today. One of the, I suppose, key notions you put forward is this notion of people-centric management. which you suggest underpins what we have today and supports the development of an idea factory. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about people-centric management?
Yeah, so I mean, I actually like to call this Vinette Nair, the CEO of HLC Technologies for a long time, started calling this employees first, customers second. I like to think of it as just that idea of putting customers second. We know in business for a lot of time we've paid lip service to the idea that the customer is always right. Sure. Although depending on, in the US, if you're any major airline, you pretty much don't believe the customer is right ever, right? So depending on your customer service scores, you may not even believe that. But it again is, to me, a little bit short-sighted in the sense that I believe that raving fans, that customer loyalty, that all of those things are actually an effect that shows they're an effect. And that begs the question, what is the cause? And the cause is, as you say, is a people-centric management idea. Vinette Nair sort of coined this term, the value zone. And so what he did was he looked at his own company and he said, where is the value zone? The value zone being defined as what are the roles or activities that interact with the customer? What is, to use restaurant lingo, what is front of house and what is back of house? And what are those things that matter? And it's the value zone where all of the value is created. Whether you're a product or a service-based business, your interaction with the customers determine whether and how loyal they are, how much value is created, all of those sort of things. Now, in the academic world, unbeknownst to Vinette Nair, in the academic world, there have been decades of data on what they would call the service profit chain. And it's, again, this idea that in primarily service-based businesses, although product-based businesses are increasingly becoming more and more about the customer experience and then hence service-based. In any of those businesses, you have this idea that customer loyalty follows employee satisfaction and that employee satisfaction follows a sense of accountability to the employees and putting employees first. And so it's true, and it's been proven by data, but also by experience, that the only real way to get lasting, sustainable customer loyalty is to get lasting, sustainable employee loyalty. And the only way to get that is to make sure employees feel taken care of, protected, resourced, and all of the things they need. So you put your frontline people in the value zone first so that they can put the customers first. But too many organizations, I think, ask their frontline employees to have a divided loyalty between getting the customer what the customer wants, but also getting the management structures and support functions, those things that frontline is being held accountable for. And I believe, and many others agree, that it should work the other way around. That really everyone in the organization ought to be accountable to the people in the value zone so that those people can be accountable to the customer.
Sure. And that makes perfect sense. I think if you have, engaged employees who are passionate about what they do, they've got a sense of autonomy, ownership over their job, and sense of ownership over the company, I guess, then they become a lot more protective of the brand. Is that what you're suggesting? Yeah, no,
pretty well put. I mean, the biggest question is really taking a deep dive in your organization and going, what action, we tend to assume based on pay scales that the higher up in the hierarchy you go, the more valuable the position is. And that may be true as far as responsibility and hence compensation, but it may not be true in terms of creating raving fans, creating loyal customers. And so that's the real question. You might be the type of firm that doesn't actually have any frontline interaction with the customer because you work through third-party retailers and those sort of things. And so, it may be, especially if you're a product-focused business, that your value zone is actually the people who design the products for the customer. And so what are you doing in your organization to make sure that value zone is the one that everyone's held accountable for? But really, It begins with that. We tend to assume that the higher up in the traditional hierarchy you go, the more valuable it is. And that's really not true for a customer loyalty standpoint. It's really about determining where do we commit the actions, where do we do the activities that produce customer loyalty, and how do we make that our value zone to which everything else is accountable? Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And, you've talked about going up the hierarchy, and the higher you go, the more value there is. And I think there's a lot of, it's kind of synonymous with the traditional view on innovation, top-down innovation, senior management makes all the decisions. However, we're now seeing a move away from that, which is more about co-creation and engaging. Innovation is basically holistic. It's everyone's job. It's not just the company's job, but it's about engaging people from outside the organization. So I guess I kind of wanted to use that as a segue into this concept of no managers, which, you talk about, the idea of, I guess it kind of sounds akin to self-forming teams or self-managing teams. You drive this sort of, or you advocate this model in your book. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about this? Yeah, and I would say I don't know that I advocate any particular model, right? So self-management teams is definitely one way that it happens. I really tried to shy away in writing under new management from holacracy because that's one that's getting a lot of buzz right now. And actually, the more buzz an idea gets, the quicker the is that it's going to be a fad. Now, it might be here to stay, but it made me sort of suspicious, right? And really, there's a deeper principle that all of these specific methodologies have behind them, and that's what I was really trying to get at, which is this idea that no management doesn't necessarily, no manager doesn't necessarily mean no management. We just, especially in a knowledge work organization, we face a really interesting dilemma in management. You know, when we invented management, I mean, and it's hard to think about management as an invention, but it really was. It was when firms began to grow to sizes we had never encountered before, and we had to start thinking about this professional class whose job was to supervise and train and monitor and compensate and all those sort of things. When it was invented, you could pretty much say across the board that management knew more about how to do the total job than any one individual employee, right? Frederick Taylor in the United States invents scientific management by basically saying it's manager's job to figure out the sequence of activities and the best way to produce a product, and it's labor's job to not think and just take orders. Yeah. In a knowledge work organization, the balance of power in that situation gets disrupted because it's very likely that if you are an individual contributor, you actually do know more about your job than does the manager.
That's right.
And so you have a level of sort of expert power over the manager, and that creates a really interesting tension that a lot of companies are resolving by basically saying, okay, well, if you are the individual contributor, you know more about how to do the job, well, we'll give the autonomy back to you to decide how to do it, right? If you know what needs to get done. Or we'll give it to the team, or we'll find some other way to sort of disperse the activities that we used to rely on that professional class of managers for. We'll disperse that amongst the entire organization. And so in under new management, I look at some companies that sort of became flatter because of that, some that became very team-based because of that and had no management structure whatsoever. But the end goal is the same, that if you're in an organization where your individual contributors usually know more about how to do the job than the managers, then you ought to be thinking about how to maximize the amount of autonomy and responsibility you're giving to those individual contributors.
Yeah, and that ties in beautifully with the whole concept of, put your employees first. Because I think if you give them that ownership, like you've said, they're more likely to perform at a higher level, as opposed to just being dictated to from the top.
Absolutely. And those two ideas really do go hand in hand. And if you could still even be using the term manager, but the message you ought to be sending is the idea that it's a manager's job to be accountable to the people in the value zone who are creating the value. And so management becomes a support function, not a supervisory function. Sure.
Would you say there's any relation to the concept of agile management, self-forming teams, small teams? I know Peter Diamandis puts forward the notion of teams of 5 to 7 people working relentlessly with focus, passion, autonomy will do a lot better than a team of 100 with top-down management. Any relation there?
And I would say so overall. Most of the companies I look at under new management replaced their top-down, one manager and a team structure with more of a team-based or a self-managed team function. As far as how Agile plays into it, Agile is actually a great way to teach a team how to supervise itself and make course corrections on the fly and that sort of thing. So definitely. That said, it doesn't necessarily, I look at a company called Morningstar Farms, which is a tomato processing company, everything from vine to packaging and States, and they're not really run on self-managing teams. They're run on individuals being taught how to sort of manage themselves and the relationships of who their internal customers are, et cetera. So most companies, I think, that try and go towards I titled the chapter in the book, Fire the Managers, but try to go to that idea of the dispersing the management function, go to a team-based system, but it doesn't mean you have to. And it really depends on the context of the company that you're in.
Sure, that makes sense. Okay, wanted to touch on the topic of communication and email. I've long been a fan of the Tim Ferriss school of checking email, 2 times a day, maybe 3 times a day at set time frames. Personally, it's had a huge impact on my focus and productivity. I don't suffer the cognitive switching penalties that one does when they knee deep in a task, and then suddenly I got this email, and then I start chasing this little, fluffy white rabbit down the rabbit hole, and before I know it, I've spent 30 minutes doing all this other stuff that wasn't even on my to-do list for the day. So I've basically put myself at the mercy of others rather than, taking care of what I need to get done. And you talk about, email essentially, I suppose, impacting productivity adversely in your book. Do you want to talk to us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so what I look at in new management are companies that have basically decided collectively to outlaw, right? So basically what we're trying to, company-wide, we're trying to do something that looks a lot like the Tim Ferriss school of I only check it a few times a day, right? And that can look like banning internal email entirely, which I look at a company called Atos based out of France that did it entirely and replaced it with this really interesting internal system that looks like a mix of a message board and a social network and a chat room kind of all at once. It's really cool. Again, custom tailored for what they were doing. And then there are other companies that basically put limits on it. So they either shut the email server off at a certain time of day and say, you can still respond to your emails, but they won't actually send. They'll just gather in your outbox, and then that way they won't bother other people. Actually, my favorite policy is Daimler in Germany has this policy called mail on holiday, which basically is you get the standard, you set it, and then when people email you, they get the standard, I'm out of the office until such and such date. But then there's a little line in it that says, and so your email will be deleted. If it's important, please email me back on the day that I return to work, right? Which I think is great. And there is a lot of research that you already alluded to on the distracting powers of email, right? Email as a tool. Well, first of all, email as a tool was never invented to handle the stuff that we are giving to it, right? Yeah. But even as a tool, if you or Outlook or Gmail or any of them sort of work, it's set up in such a way to push emails to you as you get them, right? So if you leave your Outlook running in the background, you're constantly being pinged with the new emails that come in and being asked to task switch from whatever deep work you were doing to the email, or maybe you're still in the email box from the last email you got 5 minutes ago. And so you never actually get out of your email box, right? Beyond that, there's actually a lot of research now showing about the way that employees respond to email at night has an effect on their relationships both at home and at the office, and adding more stress into those and all those sort of things. What I like about all of these policies is that, unlike the sort of Tim Ferriss approach, they're doing it sort of company-wide. If you're a solopreneur, Tim's idea of only check it at 8 in the morning and 4 in the afternoon, and then have an autoresponder that tells people, hey, I only check email at 8 and 4, so I'll get back to you whenever is closest to those. That works great until your boss accidentally, your boss sends you an email and gets that autoresponder back. And then, you've got a teed-off manager to deal with. So the idea is that for a company situation, this needs to happen at a company-wide level or a management-led level, because to try and do it sort of as an individual creates some amount of tension. Because there are all sorts of assumptions about how much you're supposed to be on and when you're supposed to be off and all that sort of stuff, that unless you're having the conversation at a company-wide level all at once, I think you have a lot of people who want to put limits on their email that don't actually get the chance to without sort of management's blessing. So I'm much more in favor of looking at it at an entire company-wide idea. If you are a solopreneur or a freelancer, I think the Tim Ferriss method works great. I would add that, honestly, if you are checking it twice a day, most of the time you don't even need that autoresponder to warn people about it. You can just respond when it is that you respond, and most people don't even know. I think we feel like we need to respond to an email much faster than the person sending it feels like they should wait before asking why you never responded.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I think you touched on a few interesting points there. We are using email in ways that was never intended. It was only ever intended to be a communication tool. However, now it's become a way for us to manage tasks. People use it for storage. And I guess someone may say, I need to dig up that proposal file that I sent to that client. So they'll jump into their email rather than have it held somewhere else. And while they're looking for it in their email, they'll see all these emails that have come through, and they suddenly start responding to them. And before they know it, they've spent, half an hour, if not longer, responding to these emails, and their mindset is somewhere completely different, that they've forgotten all about that proposal that they were supposed to dig up and work on.
Yeah, no, you hit the nail on the head almost exactly, right? That originally this thing was invented to send messages between academic universities and short little message. We basically use it as the to-do list for our jobs. And, there are whole companies that sell realistic job preview exercises. So things you're supposed to give to people to decide whether or not you should hire them. And all it basically is an in-basket exercise. We send you a fictional inbox and then we just watch how you do it, which is great if you're hiring someone whose job it is to delete email. But I don't know anybody that's the job description for. So really, we've taken this thing and just run away with it. And we've never had the conversation about, is this the best tool for internal communication?
Sure.
And if it's not, what should we switch to?
Yeah, well, that's exactly right. And on what should we switch to, is there a difference between internal email versus external email and the way we should be approaching either?
I wouldn't say there's necessarily a difference. I mean, I think it'd be way better if we can have these real-time, either phone or face-to-face conversations more often. That said, I think it's a lot harder to teach clients how to email you, right? So if that's their preference, you usually end up having to do what the client prefers, if that's a phone call, and that varies by the individual client. So I think it's just much harder to do. And really, I mean, the majority of the emails most of us deal with every day are internal. If we work for a bigger company, they're internal emails. And so we can make a huge impact just by starting it internally, and that's inside of kind of our sphere of control.
That makes sense. So have you got any thoughts on Slack then? I mean, Slack is a tool that, has just gone, off the charts in the last couple of years as far as a communication tool is concerned, first in the startup community, but now it's starting to transcend the barriers and be adopted by much larger organizations. Do you see Slack as helping to increase productivity, or do you see it as perhaps another distracting tool where people may just end up, chatting to each other all day?
Well, tool is a tool, and it comes down to how we use it.
Correct.
If we decide after a conversation about what our communication needs are to ban internal email and move to Slack, then that's definitely a positive.
Yeah.
If we decide to create a Slack for our company, but then people can still use email, et cetera, then that's a problem, because now we're just adding one more thing to it. Functionally, that said, I mean, I actually really enjoy Slack. I'm part of a couple different Slack groups, not internal corporate-wise, but just other authors and speakers and other entrepreneurs and just a bunch of different, et cetera. And I noticed one thing early on in my experience with Slack that makes me really like it, which is this is the only time I've ever seen any app in any function ever do this. It was that Slack's default system attempts to minimize your number of notifications, right? In other words, like I joined it, and for the first 2 days, I was getting notified of every single thing anybody was ever putting into it, whether that was on my desktop or phone or whatever, and the whole thing was blowing up. Yeah. And then the automated system actually said, and we don't want to bug you too much. So we're going to switch, if you're okay with it, to just notifying you when people actually send directly to you, which was crazy, right? From Facebook to Twitter to email to everything else I've ever experienced software-wise has been looking to disrupt me more. I mean, Facebook's trying to take over my freaking iPhone with all of the different apps that it wants me to install. And yet here is Slack saying, hey, it's about the quality of the communication, and so we're going to distract you less and let you focus on work. Mind-blowing in a sense, right? And I think it's one of the reasons the technology has scaled.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I turned off all of my notifications on my phone a very long time ago, and my mind still boggles when I see, people in the workplace who have all these notifications, and they're literally popping up every few minutes. Something's popping up, and they're constantly being distracted. They can never get into a state of focus or flow. And Slack is definitely one of the few tools that doesn't try and intrude upon you and just remind you that, hey, we exist, come and visit us and come back to the site. Because I think if the product, does what you need it to do and you truly love the product, it shouldn't have to remind you to come back every, minute.
Yeah, but see, again, I mean, people resort to the most common ringtone on the iPhone is the one that came installed on the iPhone. And, the same way with their Outlook at work. If the IT email and their Outlook inbox and sets it to check automatically at every 5 minutes, then that's what 80% of people are going to do, right? So you and I definitely went in and turned all those notifications off. Most people don't. They just default to whatever kind of comes with it. And they never have that individual look at what are my communication needs. But we also a company-wide look at what are our communication needs, right? We basically just let Microsoft or Mac decide for us.
Well, that's right. And I think, you touched on the point earlier, the tool is a tool, but it comes back to how you use it. And ultimately, I think driven people or curious people who want to get the most out of their day will seek out these changes, and they'll seek out the default settings and change them. And I guess that's more of a broader cultural issue within organizations where people perhaps want to be, I suppose, plowing through their emails and feeling productive and responding to things rather than saying, hey, let's spend a little bit of time to come up with a better solution to this, which is going to impact our productivity. Do you think there is, I suppose, a broader cultural issue at play here when it comes to email and doing things that make us feel like we're productive as opposed to, doing things that actually are productive?
I mean, I definitely think that it feels productive, and we like that feeling for sure. I mean, if you ever get to inbox zero, you do a little dance and you reward yourself with, a nice walk, and you get back and then you've got emails again, so it's over, right? So, I mean, I definitely think that we're creatures of progress. We really love to feel like we're making progress on stuff. The challenge is that if all we did was clear out our email inbox by just firing the email back to the other person and it's coming right back to us, we didn't really make progress, right? We didn't actually move the ball down the field. We just ran around on the lateral line and didn't actually make any progress. So,
that's right.
So yeah, I think we definitely love that it can feel that way, but we have to take a deep look at figuring out whether or not this is actual progress.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that just comes back to, Stephen Covey, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. Let's not prioritize urgent over important. I think it's a book I read back in my early 20s, and I think that whole concept has just stuck to me. It's still rock solid to this day, and I think it applies to so much that we do.
Yeah.
Fantastic. So you mentioned earlier a few topics such as top-down management, giving people more ownership and power to make decisions. And I think, the whole notion of top-down management, I guess it comes back to, the industrial age in a way. I'm the boss, you guys are the laborers, go out, do this work, and that's basically the end of it. And you talk about the traditional vacation policy in your book. And, I think the 9-to-5 workday, the traditional vacation policy, a lot of the things that we kind of take for granted today is kind of like a throwback to that era. However, we're now living in an age where there's all sorts of technology which are enabling us to work remotely, collaboration software. Obviously, the internet's come along in the last 25 years and become a tool that's completely, radically changed the way we work. What do you think about the traditional vacation policy, and what should we be considering as an alternative? Yeah,
so I mean, I'm obviously not really a fan of it. Otherwise, I wouldn't have taken aim at it under new management. But it's an interesting thing. So the vacation policy that we have, right, that most people have as a default, it basically runs like, okay, so you work for us for a salary, and then you'll get a certain amount of days where you get off, and then those don't count as days work. And then some places, if you don't take those, you lose them. In other places, if you do take them, or you don't take them, you get paid for them, or you only get a certain amount, et cetera, et cetera. It all comes from, we forget in like history of business and history of figuring out what to do with employees. For the longest time, there was no vacation policy because you were paid for when you showed up. You showed up for that day, you get paid for that day, right? You don't get paid for that day, it's your vacation.
That's
right?
it.
And then when we started moving to the industrial age, we started needing to know that the factory line was running 24/7 in order to meet our production goals. So we had to start providing guarantees that people would be there. So we started doing contracts and salaries, and this idea that it came with a certain number of days off, and that way we knew that we could count on everybody who needed to be there when they needed to be there. Right? Then we shifted to more and more salary work and knowledge work, which was essentially saying, now we're paying you a salary because we're paying you for results. And if you do those results, everything is great. And eventually, I mean, early on when we moved to that, we were still paying attention 9 to 5 or 8 to 5 when people were in the office. And gradually we've sort of come apart from this notion that presence always equals productivity. And so we've gotten to, I mean, a lot of knowledge workers now work in an environment where They don't necessarily track when they come in and when they come out as long as they're meeting their results, right? Which is great, except that for a lot of firms, we're still tracking that vacation days thing, which is a little crazy. We're still tracking. We're not tracking the days that you work, but we are tracking the days that you don't work. And so a number of companies now have basically decided that's ludicrous, mostly led by their employees. The big company that I feature in Under New Management, Netflix, is the one that sort of made this famous. They weren't the first one. They won't be the last. But they made this famous. And the story goes, essentially, Reed Hastings, the CEO and founder, had two things happen in close succession to each other. The first was that they started getting ready to take the company public. And before then, they actually had a normal vacation policy. You get so-and-so days off. And then what they asked was, you keep track of the days that you took off throughout the year, and then just let us know, and everything will be fine. And it was the accountants that basically went back and said, you can't operate that on just like the trust system. It's not going to work, et cetera, et cetera. You have to have a more formal policy. At the same time, an employee basically came to Reed Hastings and said, you don't track our days worked. Why are you tracking our days not worked? And so he's thinking about these two things in turn. And he goes back to the accountants and the law people and all the people that are getting ready for the IPO. And they said, is there any rule that says we have to have a vacation policy? And they were like, I don't know what you mean. It's like, well, what if we just said we don't have a vacation policy, so take whatever you need? And they basically said, yeah, okay, the state of California will allow that. So that's what they did. They basically, their vacation policy was we don't have one. Doesn't mean there's no vacation. It just means we're not tracking it. We've chosen to not track it. And there's the jury's sort of still out as far as what effect unlimited vacation has on the number of vacation days taken. Right? Some people say people take less. Others say people are going to abuse the policy and take more. The last research I've seen on it shows that for the majority of companies, people take about the same amount of days as they would take before, give or take. I make the argument in Under Management that this whole thing is actually not about vacation days at all. It's about trust. What Reed Hastings had was a dilemma of trust. Right? They had already defaulted to trust with the keep track of your own vacation days thing. And even then, employees felt like the company wasn't trusting them enough. And so they took it one more step further, and they said, you know what, we trust you to keep track of it all. We have no vacation policy anymore. We'll hold you accountable for getting results, but we're not going to hold you accountable for how many days you take on or off. We trust you. And that had a really positive effect, so much so that the next kind of policy change that happened at Netflix was they changed their expense report policy. They changed it to a 5-word long policy, act in Netflix's best interest. Right? And that's it. And again, a huge trust role, right? And I look at it, under management, I look at companies that both did and did not perform well in an unlimited vacation condition. And really the deciding factor isn't days taken or anything like that. It's trust. It's, are you moving towards unlimited vacation in a way that signals to your employees that you trust them to act in your interest and their interest, and you trust them to act like adults? And if so, it's going to be a successful thing. And if you don't, then it's going to backfire. And there's a lot of research about trust and trustworthiness that supports this idea that it's reciprocal. In other words, if I act trustworthy to you, you are far more likely to actually be trustworthy.
Well, it's the whole notion of give people a reputation to live up to, and they'll live up to it, rather than talking down to them as if they're your inferiors. Right.
And I'm not a optimist in denial, right? I know that not everyone will, but if out of 100 people, one person takes advantage of your trust, then you deal with that one person. You don't create a policy that says, I don't trust the other 99 of you who have done nothing wrong.
Yeah, definitely. And I think in this sort of remote working economy as well, we're looking at disruption rates to the S&P 500, and I know Insight released an update on their report which found that half of the S&P 500 faces replacement in the next 10 years or so. And what we're seeing by, your emerging generations, be they Gen Y or even Gen Z, no doubt, is that they want to embrace remote working and the ability to work from anywhere. And there's more and more opportunities opening up for them to do that via different sort of companies and online revenue generating streams. And do you think it's in the company's best interest, in order to attract and retain top talent coming through, to have these sort of unlimited vacation policy? Because people will, it may enable them to travel and work at the same time, or...
Yeah, I mean, so a lot of the companies that have embraced an unlimited vacation policy are basically those ones that are either already geographically dispersed or are virtual, or are ones that are very results oriented. And so what they were finding was that even when people were taking vacation, they were doing some amount of work. So if you can get your work done, but you want to spend the entire week at a beach with your family where you're on your laptop working for a number of hours in the week, and then the rest of the time you're interacting with family. I mean, if you're getting your results done, most of what these companies are basically saying is, why bother? What I think is really interesting, and I close the chapter in Under Management with this, is that there's even some hospitals that have experimented with it, which if you think about the idea behind why we went to what became the traditional vacation policy, it was this idea that we needed people there 24/7, so we had to find a way to guarantee it. And so a hospital is actually a great example of, you can't do the work of a hospital somewhere else.
That's right.
Nor can you do the work of a hospital if you don't have a full team of people to do it with, right? So even there, though, we find that when you act in a way that signals trust to your employees, they respond with trustworthy behavior. It's still working even in that system, which I think is really telling about why this isn't about where you work and how often you work and when you do that work, et cetera, that it's really about trust.
Yeah, and again, it comes back to our first topic of discussion, which was empowering your employees. Putting them first, giving them ownership. And I think if you do that, you start to develop trust and reciprocal sort of respect, and that pays off, like you just said in the hospital example. So very interesting. And I guess on traditional sort of ways of doing things, let's talk performance reviews. I think they're the bane of many a corporate employee's existence in some way. In my opinion, I've always felt that they were quite cookie cutter, usually aligned to very generic sort of role core competencies used by HR as sort of a tick and flick exercise. And, these podcasts generally were all about, corporate innovation. And most of these performance reviews tend not to support innovation because they don't incentivize doing something that doesn't quite fall in line with your core responsibilities. For example, if you're a financial controller, you're not going to go out and come up with ideas and build prototypes and stuff like that, or try and find out something that may support some sort of a new product development. KPIs generally tend to be quite short-term and tied to bonuses, and therefore you're going to just do anything to get that bonus. And they basically don't incentivize taking risks. And I guess, what's your opinion on the performance review process in terms of, I suppose, getting the most out of people and helping them come out of their box in a way, which I think is quite empowering when you give people the opportunity to do something above and beyond just being, say, a financial controller.
Yeah, well, let me start by saying that the goals of performance reviews are noble, right? So the original intent of the performance review is hugely noble. The idea was, we give people feedback, we give them tangible signals of where they are in their performance and where they can improve, and they will improve, right? That's still accurate.
Yeah.
The challenge is that feedback is, for starters, that feedback is not happening nearly frequently enough. Most companies that do a performance review do so annually. Some of them do so every 6 months, but most do so annually. And actually, the reason, at least in the United States, where I am, the reason that they do them annually is that the first institution to come up with the performance evaluation was the federal government, and the federal government decided it needed to be minimum once a year, and once a year then became the default, even as performance reviews spread to for-profit companies. Which is ironic, because most companies now and most senior leaders of companies will tell you that the pace of business has picked up, and yet the pace of how we're giving feedback doesn't, right? So this is a little strange. So the other issue is that they tend to be over-focused on the label, right? In other words, I'm going to either give you one overarching, you're an exceptional performer, or an adequate performer, or an underperformer, or I might have 4 or 5 different categories of how I assess performance for your job, and I'm going to give you a label in each. And when we make it kind of about that label, or when we include that label, a lot of the conversation that should be an open, honest conversation about feedback and how do we improve and all of those sort of things becomes a negotiation. Why did you pick the label that you picked, and why didn't you pick it higher, et cetera? And there's actually some interesting research that shows that managers will pick a label for an employee that when the employee sees it, they're most likely disappointed. They were expecting something higher. right? So even though managers may give an employee something they think is a good rating, the employee will still think it's not as high as it should be. True or not true, it reemphasizes the point that when we make it about labels, we can't have that open and honest conversation. And so many organizations are basically saying, forget it. The goals of this are not actually being met by the tool, so we're going to throw that tool away and we're going to replace it with something else. And the most successful example that I profile in energy management is the Adobe company. They make Photoshop and a bunch of products inside Adobe Creative Cloud. Yep. And they basically, when they switched from box software sold at brick and mortar stores to a cloud subscription-based system for delivering their software, that sort of triggered a conversation about what else are we using on an annual cycle that happens faster, that the pace of change happens faster, and the performance reviews was one of them. So they did away with performance reviews and they replaced it with training their managers how to have a series of informal conversations they call check-ins. And check-ins are great. A check-in happens, every month or six weeks or so, and all that it requires for it to be a check-in is an informal conversation. It can be as short as 10 minutes. Yeah. Well, feedback with development. Feedback is, what feedback do you have for your employees about how they're doing their job? What feedback about how you're supporting them? Expectations is also reciprocal, right? So are you meeting the expectations? Should we set expectations before the next time? Am I meeting your expectations, or do I need to make improvements? And then growth and development, where do you fit into the organization? Where do you want to go, and how can I help you get there? As long as those three things are being met, we have a check-in. And the idea is to have these much more frequently, so we're providing that feedback much more frequently, and that it stays informal. So it's not just a negotiation about whether or not you were adequately judged, which is what most annual reviews are. They're just this debate about whether or not what's getting written down on paper is accurate. So we do away with the writing it down on paper at all, and we just train people on how to have those feedback conversations.
Yeah, it's funny you should say that. It sounds very similar to some of the product development sort of methodologies. Like when I compare waterfall, for example, to say agile or lean startup, waterfall is very intrinsic. It's all, you might align that with very company centric, and then you commit something for the next 6 months, maybe 12 months, and then you deliver it, and you find that the results aren't there, and that there's been a lot of issues along the way that should have been identified earlier. Whereas you move to an agile sort of setup, or you use a lean startup, and it's all about short, sharp iterations and very customer centric, which in this case is, I suppose, the employee. It's all about the employee, checking in with them on a regular basis, finding out how they're going, what they're struggling with, where they want to go, how can we help them get there. And so over a 12-month period, rather than just hoping for the best at the end of that 12-month period, you've actually checked in with them, say, maybe 12 times over that time. You've made a lot of changes, you've provided a lot of feedback and provided guidance, and by the end of that period, they're in a much better place than they would have been if you had just had that one conversation 12 months ago.
Yeah, absolutely.
Interesting. So I guess I just wanted to touch on the org chart as well. You suggested that we work best in teams that change often. How does this support innovation? For example, when there's no hierarchy, you kind of do away with this concept of, well, my idea is the right idea because I'm on top, so you just go out and execute what I say. I think in a flat sort of organization, the kind of IDEOs of the world, perhaps there's less fear of sharing. There's no blocking of ideas coming from sort of middle managers or senior managers. And I suppose innovation then becomes more of a team effort, more of a holistic effort. It becomes everyone's job. There's more opportunity for serendipity if people are working in different teams, meeting different people, getting across different skill sets. Just keen to hear a little bit more about this concept of having, I suppose, less of a hierarchy in an organization.
Yeah, well, so let me start by saying IDEO is not a totally flat hierarchy. They definitely have one. They just rotate it around a lot, and they have a culture. To your point, they have a culture that says it's not about sort of innovation from the top down.
Correct.
Writing the org chart in pencil is less about not having a management structure, which we've actually already talked about, and we kind of covered in a different chapter. But the research behind writing the org chart in pencil comes from two different places. The first is directly as it pertains to innovation. We find that a more structure that allows for kind of a refreshing of old and new connections, old and new colleagues, a combination of sort of systems that provide from the older colleagues and fresh ideas from the newer colleagues. Not this not being a function of age, but I say old and new, meaning how long you've been on the team. That's usually the sweet spot when it comes to innovative ideas that actually get executed on, right? Too many, if everybody is brand new to the project, then you'll get lots of fresh ideas and very little traction. If everybody's been around forever, they'll keep doing it the way they've always done it. So that constantly refreshing and getting together, performing, and then disbanding and going into different teams, that's kind of that sweet spot. And there's a lot. Yeah. The other challenge is that in a constantly changing business environment, and one that to just sort of stay alive, we have this challenge because the org chart was designed for systems that don't change, right? The org chart was first drawn to solve a management problem in the railroad industry, which, if you think about it, railroad is sort of the textbook example of an industry that does not change often, right? Once you lay track, that track stays where it is unless you pull it up and then route a new line, which is hugely expensive. So we don't change it very often, right? Some tracks that even now trains are being run on have been around for hundreds of years, right? So we don't change it very much. Right? But most people in a more knowledge work company and more knowledge work economy, the products have to change often. The response to market demands causes a lot of change. And if we're still drawing our lines and boxes and legs of the hierarchy based on an idea that we're never going to change, then what we have are reactions to the market are huge swings, right? So I used to work in the pharmaceutical industry, and this was a textbook example of poor design because we focused on the product. You would have a sales force that was trained on selling a product, and then when that product went generic or was discontinued for some reason, a lot of people were losing their job, right? Because those people were trained on how to sell one drug that we don't sell anymore. So that job is eliminated, right? We're going to lay off or sell off that whole line, right? And then, of course, fast forward 18 months and we have this new product that's out, and suddenly we need a bunch of new sales reps to sell this new product. And, of course, we've laid off all of those people, so we can't get them back. They went and found new jobs. So now we've got to find brand new entrants into the company. We have these huge kind of binge and purge cycles that a lot of companies do to deal with recessions and boom times and those sort of things. Sure. And it turns out that that's really not in the best interest of the company in terms of resiliency. A better central piece to make to how we make design decisions is the project, which is what companies like IDEO do. Industrial design lends itself to project-based org design, but so do consulting firms and a couple other industries. And the idea, again, is that you look at what are the projects that we're engaged in, and then how do we draw teams based on that, knowing that 18 months, 24 months down the road, these projects are going to change and we're going to need to reshuffle the teams. So it's why I call the chapter Writing the Organizational Chart in Pencil. It doesn't mean you don't write one. It means that you write one in such a way that you can erase it often and rewrite it and change those reporting relationships and adapt. And what you find is that from an innovation standpoint, you get a better sweet spot of old and new ideas. And from a resiliency standpoint and from a binge and purge layoff cycles, you might even get more resiliency to market changes without having to take such drastic action. So good for the employees, good for the company, good for innovation, good all around.
Yeah, makes sense. So here at Collective Campus, we, aside from being an innovation consultancy, we're an open plan sort of co-working space for tech startups. And in your book, you talk about large organizations who've adopted activity-based working or, collaborative spaces, and how the benefits of these spaces are actually outweighed by some of the costs. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, so this is one of those people sometimes accuse, like, all these the ideas in this book are just, here's what tech companies are doing. Not true. This is definitely an example of what tech companies are doing that's probably wrong, right? Yeah. So a number of years ago, the trend towards, decades ago, the trend towards open office spaces began. And it began because of two factors, right? The first was there started to be this interesting research on the benefits of openness in office environment for collaboration and serendipitous meetings and innovation and all of that sort of stuff. And then, of course, we transitioned into kind of more, let's say, recessionary times, right? Where we had to figure out how to do more with less. And open office spaces are definitely cheaper than giving everyone their own office. You can put more people per square foot or per square meter into an open office. I tend to think that second one is what drove the trend more than the first one, at least as far as decision making, et cetera. But I can't deny that there is research that sort of supports that idea. The challenge is there is also research that supports the idea that in an open office space, people are more likely to feel stressed. They're more likely to feel distracted. So, you might have an open office space that outlawed email, but that doesn't mean you outlawed distractions. They just come in a different form now.
Sure.
And so that prevents you from doing that deep work. My favorite study actually shows that people in an open office environment are more likely to call in sick to work, which means they're either legitimately sick more often or they're sick of their office.
Wow.
But in either case, they're calling in to work sick. And it turns out that I don't believe that these costs outweigh the benefits. There are definitely benefits, but there are also costs. Every decision comes with costs and benefits. And when you run that analysis, I think you find that a fully open office environment is probably not the best. The best environment, and there's a ton of research that describes this as perceived control. One of the biggest influences on satisfaction with an environment and how an environment affects productivity is the element of perceived control. How much control do I have over where I do get to do the work?
Sure.
And so this is a great amount of research in line with what some people are calling activity-based design. What I actually prefer to call designing your office to have a palette of places, meaning a variety of different places, like a palette of colors that an artist used, a variety of different environments that people can kind of migrate through. It still doesn't mean that everybody gets their own office. What it does mean is that we make available to employees open office spaces, individual corrals for deep private work, meeting rooms of all sorts of different sizes, and then we allow for people to just kind of roam throughout and do where they need to do their best work, right? Because we have the individual different types of work that people do, and then we also have the individual differences in personality, and both of those things affect where someone would choose to best do their work. And given those two things together, really the only option is to say, hey, it's not about figuring out what the best space is for everyone. There's not one best space for everyone. It's about giving everyone the possibility to find their own best space.
That's exactly right. And, I spent a little bit of time working at a Macquarie Bank, a large investment bank here in Australia, and they moved towards the whole open plan, activity-based working type of office. And, it's very much a matter of personality. You had people who absolutely hated it. They just wanted their own desk where they could put up the family photos and just retire every day from this desk and come back to it in the morning, and they could just get into the zone because that's where they were used to working. Whereas you also had people who just absolutely loved working on a different floor every day, a different office, just not being bound to any particular chair. And I wouldn't say it was, I wouldn't really draw a line down the table and say, older demographics preferred the traditional model or younger ones preferred, the open plan model. I'd say there was definitely a bit of overlap. But I guess, would you say there is an element of age involved when it comes to how people prefer to work and whether they prefer open plan versus your traditional office?
So I don't really have any data to support that.
Sure.
Anecdotally, perhaps, I think it really is a matter of not age but experience. In other words, how much experience do you have being able to do work in quiet spaces versus open places? A lot of if you just came out of university, then you're used to studying in coffee shops or the library or these big sort of open spaces, and you've perhaps never had the chance to really do that sort of deep work privately, right? So you might have a preference for it, but I can't say that it's a factor of age. It might actually also just be experiential preferences.
Sure.
And again, as the nature of the type of work that you're doing changes, right? So it could also be that more entry-level positions lend themselves to the idea of more collaboration, et cetera. We don't really know. There's a lot of confounding factors there. But anecdotally, I definitely notice it. I can't say definitively that it's because of age. It could be because of other factors that tend to correlate with age.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I think I might have one more question for you, David. And basically, just to wrap it up, how critical are some of these changes that you've put forward in your book? In an era when it's cheaper than ever to start a business, the temptation is there for many a wannabe corporate refugee to get out, start their own business, or join a tech startup. We've got people leaving investment banks and high-paid, cushy jobs to move to the Valley and do stuff there. Employee churn is at an all-time high in many large organizations. Do we propose that the changes that you're suggesting in the book will help to offset some of these, or at least help to engage and retain the right staff a little bit longer?
I mean, yes, and that's me being sort of unashamedly self-promoting and shamelessly plugging the book, definitely. But no, in all honesty, what motivated me to write this book is that I noticed these changes happening in some of the most innovative companies and some of the companies that drew the most innovative talent. Mm-hmm. And they're definitely not the mainstream. I think we're decades from these ideas being the mainstream, but these are all ideas that I think we're headed towards. Mm-hmm. And in the interim, over the next 10, 20, 30 years, what we're going to see is the more talented employees are going to gravitate towards these firms. And so you don't have to make these changes if you don't want to, but be prepared to see that the companies who do or who already are attracting a different caliber of talent that you can no longer attract. And then you'll make the changes, or you won't be around to sort of make those changes. So I definitely think there's an imperative to this. And it comes down to, I closed the book with this interview with Dane Atkinson of Sumall, which is a social media analytics company that really actually engages of all of the companies I profiled, they were actually doing the most of the different ideas in the book. They only got profiled in 2 chapters, but they were doing a lot more. And when I kind of asked him about it, he said, well, isn't that what it's about? Great leaders don't reinvent the product, they reinvent the factory. Right. And I think that's brilliant. Even if we think back to Frederick Taylor, what he was doing was reinventing the factory for the needs of that era. And what we see now is the leaders of the most innovative and most productive firms are reinventing the factory again, factory here just being a metaphor for the company, again, to give that talent what it needs to produce what the new product and the new form of productivity is. So I definitely think these are trends that are happening, and there's not necessarily an imperative to do them right off the bat, unless you think there's an imperative to attract and retain the most talented people. I think there is, and so in that case, definitely. Yeah,
great answer. So where can people get a copy of your book and find out a little bit more about your work, David?
So, the best place to find out about me is davidburkus.com. That's Burkus. There's a bunch of resources on the book there, including free resources that if you just want to kind of learn a little bit more about the book, we've got a ton of free resources, workbooks, discussion guides, interviews with some of the leaders that are doing these things. That's all free. You don't even have to buy the book to get that stuff. So I would encourage people to check that out. And then there's also links to, the retailer of your choice at that point if you want to make the decision to get the book, which if you do, I will be eternally grateful. And as you read it, feel free to send me an email and let me know your thoughts. But I would start there, davidburkus.com. And then if you're listening, we'll continue our relationship from that website for sure.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for your time, David. I'm sure our listeners will find a lot of value in the topics you've covered today. So I guess we'll leave it there. And I suppose I just want to say good luck in the playoffs with Oklahoma City. Hopefully they can bring you some joy.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I hope so too, although I'm not getting my hopes up too high.
Neither am I, just saying. Cheers, David.
Cheers.
Hey everyone, that's it for our podcast with David Burkus. Hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. We've got a star-studded array of guests coming up on the program over the next few weeks. We've got Braden Kelly from Innovation Excellence, Ben Yoskovic, the author of Lean Analytics, Soren Kaplan, author of Leapfrogging and founder of Innovation Point. We have Don Tapscott, the author of Wikinomics, Whitney Johnson of Disrupt Yourself. Clayton Christensen's had some very flattering things to say about her and her book. And we've also just locked in Steve Blank, father of the Lean Startup Movement. So look forward to bringing you all of those guests over the next few weeks. Until then, Future² out.